3 days after my father passed away, I walked into the kitchen at 10:30 in the morning and found my husband sipping coffee in his pajama bottoms. I froze with one hand still on the doorframe. "Why are you home?" Mark glanced up from his laptop. "Good morning to you too. It's Wednesday. I know what day it is." For a second, I thought maybe he'd taken leave for the death in the family. Dad's service wasn't until Friday, and I'd spent most of that morning arguing with the florist over whether Walter Hale, a man who considered throw pillows a personal insult, would have wanted an arrangement called Heavenly Garden. Then I noticed his work phone wasn't sitting on the counter. Did something happen at the office? He shut the laptop. I quit. I actually turned to look behind me, as if there were another husband somewhere who could explain what mine had just said. "You did what?" I resigned. "Yesterday." He took a sip of his coffee. "Claire, don't make it sound like I joined some cult." Normally that line would have made me laugh. Mark had always been skilled at slipping a joke into an uncomfortable moment, and across 22 years, it had rescued him from more trouble than either of us would admit. That morning, it fell flat. "Why would you quit yesterday?" He leaned back in the chair. "Because there's no point anymore. The point is usually the paycheck. You know that, right?" "No, I don't." He studied my face a moment, then said it as though he'd decided we no longer needed cable television. "Why keep working? Your inheritance is enough for both of us." I just stared at him. Dad had been gone 72 hours. I still had his final voicemail saved because I couldn't make myself delete it. Sympathy cards sat stacked beside the toaster. His obituary was still open on my tablet, and apparently my husband had already retired. "What inheritance?" Mark gave me a look. "Come on, Claire." "No, tell me." "Your father sold Hale Mechanical for millions. The house is paid off. He had investments. He barely spent a dime. How much do you think I'm getting?" "I don't know exactly." "Then how do you know it's enough for you to quit?" He hesitated, and that hesitation troubled me more than whatever he'd say next. Even conservatively, it's got to be several million. I remember thinking, conservatively, he'd already run the numbers. I hadn't even done the math myself. I knew Dad was comfortable. I knew he'd sold his commercial HVAC business 6 years back, but we had never once discussed what I'd inherit. Dad discussed his cholesterol more openly than his finances, and that's saying something. Mark reached for my hand. "Look, I've worked since I was 22. I'm 55. 33 years of quotas, airports, regional meetings, clients phoning me on a Sunday because apparently air filters count as emergencies. Maybe we finally get to live." Something in that I recognized. Mark had been worn down for years. But understanding why someone does a thing doesn't automatically make it sensible. "You quit without talking to me. I knew you'd worry. That's not an excuse. I was going to tell you. You told me after you already did it." He sighed. "Can we not do this right now?" I nearly laughed. Apparently now was the wrong moment to discuss a decision he'd made, because my father had just died. That evening, Mark's mother and sister came by. My mother-in-law brought a casserole. His sister brought wine. The first 20 minutes felt almost ordinary. Then Mark began spending Dad's money. His mother, Diane, was complaining about yet another rent hike when Mark said, "Don't stress about it, Mom. Once things settle, I'll buy you a house." I looked up. Diane blinked. "Mark, I mean it." "Oh, sweetheart, I couldn't let you." Then, barely pausing, she added, "There are some nice little ranch homes out near Westerville." That's when I understood this wasn't a brand new conversation. His sister Melissa smiled. "Look at Mom, she's already picked a zip code." Diane waved her off. "I've only looked." Mark laughed, then turned to Melissa. "We'll get you sorted too." She frowned. "Meaning?" "Your debt. The business mess. I'll give you 200 grand. Clean slate." Melissa set her fork down. "Are you serious?" "Absolutely." She stood and hugged him. I sat there holding my water glass. Nobody had asked me a single thing. Not how I was holding up. Not what Dad's estate looked like. Not what I might want done with whatever he'd left me. They had jumped straight to handing it out. "Mark." He looked at me. "What?" "Dad isn't even buried yet." The table went silent. His smile vanished. "Claire, that's not what this is." "Then what is it?" "I'm talking about taking care of family." I looked from him, to his mother, to his sister. Whose family? Diane immediately looked down. Melissa sat back. Mark's jaw tightened. That's uncalled for. So was promising $200,000 nobody asked me about. Melissa raised both hands. I don't want to be caught in the middle of this. An interesting thing to say from someone who'd accepted $200,000 roughly 40 seconds earlier. I didn't point that out. That was something I'd always been good at. Not saying the thing that would make a tense moment worse. After they left, Mark followed me into the kitchen while I wrapped up the leftovers. You humiliated my mother. I humiliated your mother. She already feels awkward accepting help. She seemed fine. Mark, I set the foil down. You had no right to promise either of them anything. We're married. What does that have to do with promising Melissa 200 grand? He rubbed his forehead. If your dad left you what I think he did, we're talking about more money than we'll ever spend. That still doesn't answer me, because you're twisting this into something it isn't. Then what is it? He gave a tired laugh. Claire, there's no such thing as your money and my money anymore. We're set. I didn't respond. Maybe because I was exhausted. Maybe because some part of me was doing what I'd done for years, deciding whether this was a fight worth having. Mark had always been generous, sometimes with things that weren't fully his to give. He'd once lent my SUV to Melissa for 4 days and mentioned it to me afterward. When his mother's water heater broke, he'd promised we'd cover it before he'd said a word to me. He volunteered our house for Thanksgiving so often that one year I found out only because Diane asked what time to bring the dinner rolls. None of it had ever seemed enormous on its own. Marriage is full of small annoyances. When you've been married long enough, you learn not every hill is worth a flag. At least, that's what I used to tell myself. The next morning, my phone rang while I stood in Dad's bedroom trying to decide which suit he should be buried in. Claire, it's Samuel Green, your father's attorney. We exchanged the usual awkward condolences, and then Samuel said, There are several estate documents Walter wanted me to review with you. Could you come in tomorrow morning? Of course. Mark can come too. A pause. Not a long one, but long enough. Actually, Samuel said, your father specifically asked that our first meeting be with you alone. I looked from Dad's doorway toward the living room. Mark sat on the couch with his laptop open, a used boat listing on the screen, and for the first time since Dad died, I wondered what my father had known that I didn't. Samuel Green's office sat on the 4th floor of an older brick building downtown. Narrow hallways, a lobby directory that looked like it had outlasted 3 mayors. I'd been there twice before with Dad, once when Mom died, and once when he sold the company. Neither memory made me eager to return. Samuel met me at the door himself. Claire. Hi, Samuel. He shook my hand, then seemed to reconsider the formality and gave my shoulder a brief squeeze. I'm sorry about Walter. Thank you. He led me into his office. A legal pad sat waiting on the table, along with a water bottle and a box of tissues placed discreetly off to the side. I noticed the tissues and immediately decided I wouldn't need them. Grief makes you competitive about the strangest things. We spent the first few minutes talking about the funeral, the death certificate, the house, ordinary estate matters. Then Samuel closed the folder in front of him. Before we get into numbers, there's something Walter wanted me to discuss with you. Okay, did Mark ever mention that he came to see your father without you? That was not the question I'd expected. Mark? No. About 8 months ago. I shook my head. No. Samuel nodded as though the answer confirmed something. He reached out to Walter more than once. An in-person conversation, a later phone call, eventually an email. About my father's estate? I sat back. My husband discussed my father's estate with him. Walter asked me to be careful how I describe those conversations. Mark wasn't threatening him. He wasn't attempting anything illegal. Somehow that made it worse. What was he doing? Samuel opened another folder. Planning. He slid a single sheet across the table. It was a copy of a letter in Dad's handwriting. I recognized the blocky capital letters instantly. Dad wrote as though every note might someday be entered as evidence. Walter authorized me to give you this after his death, Samuel said. I read the opening lines. Dad had written that Mark stopped by one afternoon and started talking about retirement. Nothing unusual at first, since Mark had complained about travel and quotas plenty of times before. Then I reached one paragraph and stopped. Dad had recorded the exchange almost verbatim. Mark had said, "Once Claire inherits, I can finally stop working." Dad had answered, "Claire inherits." And Mark had laughed. "Come on, Walter, we're married." I read it twice. Samuel waited. "Did that bother him?" I asked. "Yes." "Why didn't he say something to me?" "We'll get to that." I looked back down at the page. What bothered me was how precisely it matched what Mark had said in our kitchen. There isn't going to be your money and my money. Apparently, that idea hadn't shown up 3 days after Dad died. It had already been there. Samuel opened the estate folder. "Your father did very well when he sold Hale Mechanical. He invested cautiously afterward, after charitable gifts, estate costs, and the other provisions in his plan. The assets set aside primarily for you are currently valued at roughly 3.8 million, not counting the house." I don't recall having any dramatic reaction. Mostly I thought, Mark wasn't far off, and I hated that thought. Samuel continued, "Most of those assets are held in a trust Walter set up before he died." "A trust for me?" "Yes, you're the beneficiary." "What does that mean in practice?" "It means you're financially secure. The trust can provide income and distributions for housing, medical costs, retirement planning, and your general welfare. It isn't meant to put you on an allowance." "Good, because I'm 52. Samuel smiled faintly. Walter made essentially that same point. That sounded like Dad. "The unusual part," Samuel went on, "is that for the first 5 years, any extraordinary distribution of principal requires sign-off from an independent corporate trustee." Extraordinary meaning? A large gift to another person would certainly qualify. A major speculative investment might. Putting several $100,000 into a relative's business would. I stared at him. So Dad put someone between me and the money for certain decisions, temporarily, because of Mark. Samuel took his time answering. Partly, he said, because Walter had been worried about pressure. That irritated me, not at Samuel, at Dad. "I'm not 12. "No." He could have talked to me. "Yes." Instead, he built a financial fence around me. Samuel leaned back. "Would you like to know how Walter explained it?" I nodded. He pointed to the second page of Dad's letter. Dad had written that he didn't know whether Mark would ever actually pressure me. He said Mark had been a good husband in plenty of ways, and that 22 years of marriage meant more than one conversation about money. Then came a line that sounded exactly like my father. I could practically hear him clearing his throat before saying it. "I don't want to leave Claire my opinion of her husband along with my money." I stopped reading there. "He didn't want you spending his last months defending Mark to him," Samuel said quietly. That hurt, because Dad knew me. I probably would have done exactly that. "He wasn't trying to make a decision about your marriage," Samuel said. "He wanted to make sure nobody could rush you into one about the money." I finally reached for one of the tissues I'd sworn I wouldn't need. Samuel had the decency not to mention it. When I got home, Mark was in the kitchen. He'd showered and changed, which briefly made me feel better, until his first word was, "So?" I set my purse down. "So what?" He gave me an impatient look. "Claire, what did Green say?" "There's a trust." His expression shifted at once. "How much?" I looked at him. He caught himself. "I mean, what are the terms?" "No, you meant how much." "Fine. How much?" "I'm not discussing numbers today." "Why?" "Because I buried my father this morning." "Mark?" That stopped him for maybe 3 seconds. Then he asked, "How long until the trust pays out?" "It doesn't work that way." "What does that mean?" I explained the basics. "Not everything, just enough." Mark paced once across the kitchen. "So we need approval to use our own money. My inheritance." He turned. "Seriously, that's what this is." "Can we borrow against it?" "I don't know." "Did you ask?" "No." He exhaled sharply. "Claire, I already quit." There it was. Not I made a mistake. Not I should have talked to you. I already quit. As though his decision had generated an invoice, and I was now expected to pay it. That night, I went to bed early. Sometime after 1, I woke up thirsty and went downstairs. I heard Mark before I reached the bottom step. He was in the den, speaking quietly into his phone. "No, don't panic." A pause. "Then the money exists. It's just tied up." Melissa, I could tell from his tone. He lowered his voice further. I'll figure it out. Another pause. Then he said something I can still hear exactly as he said it. Claire will come around. I stood halfway down the staircase in the dark. Normally I'd have marched in, demanded to know what he meant, and we'd have argued until 2 in the morning, one of us eventually apologizing just to end it. Instead, I turned around and went back up, because for once, I didn't want Mark to know what I'd heard. I wanted to hear what he said when he thought no one was listening. The next morning, I made coffee and asked Mark what he'd promised everyone. Not angrily. That seemed to unsettle him more. He was at the counter, spreading peanut butter on toast, when I said, "Besides the house for your mother and the money for Melissa, what else?" He stopped. "What? What else have you planned, Mark? It's 7 in the morning." "I know." He set the knife down. "Are we really starting this again?" "I don't think we ever finished it." He stared at me a moment, then pulled out a chair. "Fine. What do you want to know?" "Everything." Mark leaned back and folded his arms. He'd been thinking about a lake place. Nothing extravagant, in his words. Maybe near Buckeye Lake, close enough for weekends. He wanted to invest enough that we could live comfortably without touching much principal. He wanted to help his mother, help Melissa travel, maybe spend January and February somewhere warm. Listening to him was strange, because none of it sounded terrible on its own. I'd complained about Ohio winters for 20 years. I liked lakes. I wanted Diane secure. I hated watching Melissa struggle. The problem was that Mark had built an entire future for us without once asking whether I wanted to live inside it. "Anything else?" "No." "You sure?" "Yes." I took a sip of coffee. "When did you quit?" "I told you. Tuesday." "No. When did you actually resign?" He looked toward the window. That was answer enough. "Mark, the morning after your dad died." I set my mug down. "Dad died late Sunday night. So, Monday morning. You called your boss Monday morning and quit." "I sent the resignation Monday morning. We'd already discussed it." I caught that. We. My boss and I already discussed when. A few weeks ago. For a second, neither of us spoke. Dad was still alive. "Claire, you were already talking about retiring while my father was still alive." "I was talking about options, based on what he—" "Don't do this." "Do what?" "Make it ugly." I almost couldn't believe it. "I'm not making anything ugly. I'm asking you a question. You're making it sound like I was sitting around waiting for Walter to die." "Were you?" "No." The answer came fast enough that I believed him. But then he added, "Your dad was 79. He was sick. We all knew what was coming." I stared at him. Mark realized at once how it sounded. "That's not what I meant." "Then explain it." He walked to the sink, then turned back around. "I've worked 33 years, Claire. 33. I've missed birthdays because some distributor in Cleveland couldn't wait until Monday. I've spent half my life eating scrambled eggs off paper plates in a Hampton Inn. I'm tired." "I know you're tired." "Do you?" "Because your father got to sell his company and retire before 60. He had choices." There was something in his voice I'd heard before, but never paid much attention to. Resentment. Not really toward Dad, toward what Dad represented. "I don't own a company," Mark went on. "I don't have some big retirement package, so when it became obvious we'd have enough." He closed his eyes. "Here we go again." "No. Answer me. When did my father's estate become your retirement account?" He grabbed his keys. "I can't talk to you when you're like this." That nearly made me smile. He was unemployed. I had no idea where he thought he was rushing off to, but apparently he had somewhere to be. I didn't stop him. Over the next 2 days, I discovered how far his plans had actually gone. First, an email landed on our shared household account from a real estate agent, thanking us for our interest in a lake property. I called. Mark had put down a refundable $5,000 deposit straight from our joint checking. That evening, Diane called and casually mentioned she'd already told her landlord she probably wouldn't renew her lease when it came up in 4 months. Then Melissa called, wanting to know if I had any sense of when things might clear. "What things?" A pause. "You know, the estate." "Why?" Another pause. "I've been talking to one of my creditors, and Mark said I shouldn't lock into a long repayment plan if I'm going to be able to settle it soon." I sat at my desk staring at the wall. Mark hadn't merely made promises, people had begun making decisions based on them. When he got home, I told him about both calls. He didn't seem particularly alarmed. "We'll sort it out. You told Melissa to stop negotiating her debt. I told her not to lock herself into something stupid. And your mother thinks she's moving. She probably is. Mark, you didn't just spend money we don't have. You changed other people's lives with it. We do have it. I have it." His face hardened. "There it is." "There. What is?" "Your money." "Yes. You've never talked like this before. Because you've never promised away hundreds of thousands of dollars I inherited from my dead father before." He shook his head. "Walter really got what he wanted with that trust. That did it. Don't blame my father because you quit your job. I didn't say that. You didn't have to." The next morning, I called Samuel. "I need to know something," I told him. Was that conversation with Dad the only time Mark brought up the estate? Samuel was quiet. "No." So I went back downtown. This time there were no tissues on the table, or maybe there were, and I simply didn't notice. Samuel opened a file. Walter authorized the release of this after his death. I want to be clear about that. He slid several printed pages toward me. The first had a title, Hale Bennett Family Investment Plan. I actually gave a short laugh, not because it was funny, but because my husband had apparently given my father's death a business plan title. I turned the page. Estimated returns, a proposed lake property, housing assistance for Diane, a section labeled Melissa Business Debt Resolution, $200,000, $250,000, then retirement projections for Mark. I kept reading. Dad's estimated estate value appeared in 3 separate places. So did my name. Claire's expected inheritance, Claire's assets, Claire's projected investment income. I flipped back to the first page. "What's the date?" Samuel didn't answer. He didn't need to. It was right there in the corner. 11 months before Dad died. I sat back. 11 months, not 3 days after. Not grief, not panic, not some rash decision made by an exhausted man following a funeral. Mark had been designing this life while Dad was still driving to the hardware store complaining about property taxes, still calling me every Sunday to ask if I'd checked the oil in my car. I went through the pages again, more slowly. Then something struck me. "Samuel, there's nothing here about what I wanted." He said nothing. There was no section on whether I wanted to retire. Nothing about my own plans. Nothing about what I might want for Emily. Nothing about the charities Dad cared about. Nothing about simply keeping the money invested. I was everywhere in those pages, and somehow nowhere in them at all. Samuel finally asked, "Are you all right?" No. It was the simplest answer I'd given all week. I closed the folder. But I finally understand why Dad was worried. Before I left, I told Samuel one thing clearly. I don't want any of the inheritance moved into our joint accounts. Not checking, not savings, not investments, not property, nothing. Handle everything carefully, and I'm not requesting any large distributions. Samuel nodded. For now, I thought. For anything Mark had promised. That evening, Mark was waiting in the kitchen. "Did you talk to the trustee?" "Yes," he straightened. "And I'm not requesting the money." His expression changed. "Any of it. Not for your mother's house. Not for Melissa. Not for the lake place." He stared at me. For the first time since Dad died, Mark didn't look irritated or offended. He looked scared. And that's when I realized something else. Until that moment, he had never actually believed I would say no. Mark didn't speak to me the rest of that evening. Not exactly. He asked if I'd fed the dog. He mentioned the dishwasher was clean. At 9:30, he stood in the den doorway and said, "I'm going to bed." We could apparently still run a household together. We just couldn't discuss the fact that he'd retired on money he didn't control. The next morning, he called his former boss. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Our house simply wasn't large enough for a 55-year-old man to have a private career crisis in the kitchen. "I'm not asking you to pretend I never resigned," Mark said. "I'm asking whether there's any way to reverse it." A long silence. "I understand." Another silence. "Yeah, of course." When he hung up, he stayed at the table. "What did he say?" I asked. "My position's already been offered to Greg." I knew Greg. Mark had complained about him for 6 years. That was fast. Apparently Greg doesn't need 3 weeks to make a decision. I let that go. Mark looked at me. They might have something else. Later. Okay. Probably less money. Okay. He gave a humorless laugh. You don't have to sound so devastated. What do you want me to say? I don't know. Maybe that we'll figure this out together. I set my coffee down. We can figure out what happens next, together. We can't pretend that quitting was a decision we made together. That distinction became the argument underneath every argument for the next week. Mark wanted me to request enough from the trust to replace 2 years of his salary while he figured things out. I said no. I wasn't threatening to stop paying the mortgage or buying groceries. I had my own income from the physical therapy office, my own savings, and we'd always split household expenses. What I wouldn't do was turn Dad's estate into severance for a resignation I hadn't even known about. Then Mark's mother and sister came over. They called it talking. Families have a remarkable number of gentle words for situations that are not gentle at all. Melissa started. Mark told us you're not requesting any distributions. I looked at him. He stared at the floor. That's right. Melissa shifted on the couch. I just wish I'd known sooner. Before what? Before I changed things with my creditors. I never told you to change anything. No, Mark did. Then Mark owes you an apology. He's your husband, Claire. Exactly. My husband, not my father's executive. Diane cut in before Melissa could answer. Let's not make this uglier than it needs to be. That phrase again. Apparently asking people not to spend my inheritance was what kept making everything ugly. Diane took a different approach. She didn't talk about entitlement. She talked about rent. Her lease had gone up twice in 3 years. She worried about another increase. She was 76 and tired of wondering whether she'd still afford the same place at 80. And here's the part that would have been easier if I'd simply hated her. I didn't. Diane had driven me to the hospital when Emily was born because Mark was 2 counties over on a sales call. She'd sat beside me through my mother's chemotherapy. She made a ridiculous cranberry salad every Thanksgiving because Emily loved it. People are inconvenient that way. They can hurt you without erasing every decent thing they've done before. After they left, I found myself thinking about that house. Not the one Mark had promised her, just something small, safe, manageable. 2 days later, I sat in Samuel's office and surprised him. What if I wanted to buy Diane a place? Samuel took off his glasses. Do you? I might. That's different from whether you can. I know. We ran through numbers. Something around $225,000 to $250,000 could buy a modest condo somewhere she liked. It would need trustee approval, but Samuel thought a carefully structured request could pass. Then he asked one question. Is this what you want, Claire? I didn't answer right away. I don't want her scared about housing. That wasn't my question. Lawyers can be irritatingly precise when they're good at their jobs. I don't know. Then don't submit anything today. So I didn't, and thank God for that. Diane showed up the following afternoon. She didn't even take off her coat. Mark said you talked to Samuel. I glanced toward the den. Mark wasn't there. He told you that? He said you might be reconsidering. I was thinking about some options. Her face brightened. A condo would actually be better than a house. Less upkeep. I hadn't mentioned a condo to her, meaning Mark had, again. I felt tired more than angry. Diane, I haven't decided anything. Her expression changed. Claire, I don't understand what there is to decide. Your father left you almost $4 million. There was that number again. Apparently Mark had shared that too. That's between me and Dad's estate. I'm not trying to pry. She absolutely was, but I let her keep going. I just think you're making decisions while you're grieving. Maybe Walter made sure you'd never have to worry about money again. I waited. Then she said it. Walter can't use it anymore. What exactly are you saving it for? I looked at her. Diane must have seen something shift, because she softened her voice at once. I didn't mean it like that, but there wasn't another way to mean it. Until then, part of me had still believed that if I gave her the condo voluntarily, I could separate my own generosity from Mark's arrogance. Sitting there, I understood I couldn't. Not yet. Because Diane wasn't waiting to see whether I wanted to give. She was waiting for me to stop refusing. I think you should keep your current lease. I said. Her face fell. Claire, I haven't submitted anything to the trustee. She stared at me a moment, picked up her purse, and left. Emily called that night. I'd been expecting it. Mom, what's going on? What did Dad tell you? That he made a foolish decision. That narrows it down. She didn't laugh. He said he retired too early because Grandpa left enough that you'd be fine. That's one version. He also said you're talking about separate accounts and lawyers. I already have a lawyer. He handles Grandpa's estate. Mom. I heard the frustration rising in her voice. Then she said, what I knew someone eventually would. Dad screwed up. But are you really going to end 22 years over money? That one stung, coming from my daughter. No. Then what are you doing? I could have told her about the 11-month-old plan. I could have sent it to her right then. Instead, I said, I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm not choosing. Good. But I don't understand. I sat on the edge of my bed. I'm trying to figure out when your father decided that being married to me meant he no longer had to ask. Emily went quiet. We hung up without resolving anything. That night, Mark came into the bedroom. We can't keep living like this. No, we can't. If we're married, we build a future together. I agree. Then you can't wall off almost $4 million and act like it has nothing to do with me. I looked at him. You quit your job without asking me. He started to speak. I kept going. You promised your mother a house without asking me. You promised your sister $200,000 without asking me. You planned your retirement before Dad even died without asking me. Claire, and now I'm supposed to prove I'm committed to this marriage. He had no answer, and somehow that was worse than another fight. I took my pillow off the bed. Mark watched me. What are you doing? Sleeping in the guest room. For how long? I stopped at the door. I don't know. And for once I didn't rush to give him an answer just because he wanted one. Mark moved into the guest room before I could change my mind about taking it myself. I came home from work the next day and found his clothes hanging in that closet, his shaving kit in the bathroom, a stack of resumes on the desk. Neither of us mentioned it. For weeks, our marriage turned strangely polite. Need anything from the store? No thanks. I'm taking the dog out. Okay, I'll be home late. Interview. Good luck. You can live with someone for 22 years and become courteous strangers remarkably fast. But Mark did start changing things. He canceled the lake property and got the deposit back. He updated his resume. He called old clients and people he hadn't spoken to in years. I heard him rehearsing answers before interviews, trying to explain why a 55-year-old man had abruptly left a perfectly good sales job without saying, well, I assumed my father-in-law was about to fund my retirement. Most importantly, he stopped asking about the trust. At first I assumed it was strategy. Then one Saturday morning I overheard him talking to Melissa while I folded towels in the laundry room. No, he said. You need to work something out with them. A pause. I know what I told you. Another pause. No, Claire didn't change her mind. This isn't about Claire. I stopped folding. His voice dropped. I shouldn't have promised you that money. I couldn't hear Melissa's reply, but I could guess it. Then Mark said, I know. A longer pause. But it wasn't mine to promise. My hands went still. That sentence shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but it was the first time I'd heard him say it. Not the trustee won't approve it. Not Claire won't release it. Not Walter tied everything up. It wasn't mine. For the first time since Dad died, I wondered if Mark actually understood. A few days later, he called his mother. I happened to be making dinner. Mom, listen to me. Don't give notice on your place. I turned the burner down. Even a few feet away, I could hear Diane's voice rising through the phone. Mark rubbed the back of his neck. I know what I said. Another burst from Diane. No, Claire didn't stop me. He glanced at me. I said nothing. He turned toward the window. I promised you something that wasn't mine. There it was again. Diane kept talking. Finally, Mark said, I know you're disappointed. I'm sorry. But that's on me. When he hung up, neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I said, thank you. He looked surprised. For what? For not making me the villain. He nodded. I did that enough already. That was probably the closest we'd come to tenderness in weeks, and that made what came next harder. The following Sunday afternoon, I asked him to sit down with me. Not in the den, not in the bedroom, but at the kitchen table. The same table where he'd promised his mother a house and his sister $200,000, while Dad's funeral flowers were still sitting in our living room. I set Samuel's folder between us. Mark looked at it. "What is that? Tell me." I slid the first page across. He read the title, Hale Bennett Family Investment Plan. His face changed. He didn't ask where I'd gotten it, which told me plenty. "You sent this to Dad." Mark leaned back. It was hypothetical. 11 months before he died. "Yes." I opened it. "Here's your retirement projection." He said nothing. "Here's the lake property." Nothing. "Here's the money for your mother." I turned another page. "And here's 200 to 250,000 for Melissa." Claire. I was exploring possibilities. "For whose money?" He rubbed his forehead. "We've already done this." "No, we haven't. Show me." "Show you what?" "Where you asked what I wanted." He looked at me. "Claire, it's 6 pages. Then it shouldn't take long." He didn't touch them, so I did it myself. My name shows up 14 times. I tapped a line, Claire's expected inheritance. Another, Claire's projected assets. Another, Claire's investment income. Then I looked at him. "Where am I?" "Your name is everywhere." "Exactly. My money is everywhere. I'm nowhere." For a while, all I could hear was the refrigerator humming. Then Mark said, "I was tired." I waited. "I know that's not an excuse." "No." He looked down at the papers. "I'd been doing the same job forever. Your dad sold his company before 60. He had his house paid off. He could help Emily with college without checking his balance first. Dad never held that over you." "I know." His answer came so quickly that I believed him, which somehow made it worse. I hadn't expected that. Mark gave a short, embarrassed laugh. Walter never had to say he was more successful than me. I knew Mark. "No, let me finish." So I did. I wanted to be done worrying about money. And yeah, I wanted to be the guy who could tell my mother she'd never worry about rent again. I wanted to help Melissa. I wanted to be the person everyone called because I could fix things. I watched him. "You wanted to feel like my father." He looked away. After a moment, he said, "Maybe." I touched the investment plan, "And you were going to use my father's money to become him." Mark closed his eyes and didn't argue. That was the moment something in me settled. Not because I'd won. I didn't feel victorious. I finally understood what had happened, and understanding it made me sadder, not happier. Mark hadn't spent 11 months plotting to rob me. He'd done something more ordinary. He'd built a story in his head where my inheritance solved every disappointment in his own life, and he'd never once noticed I was a person in that story, not an account number. Emily came by later that afternoon. I hadn't invited her for a confrontation. She'd already planned to stop by. The folder was still on the table. She noticed it. "What is that?" I looked at Mark. He nodded once, so I showed her. Emily read quietly for several minutes. Then she looked at her father. "You wrote this before Grandpa died." Mark swallowed. "Yes." "How long before?" 11 months. She stared at him. "Dad." There was more disappointment in that one word than I could have produced with an hour of yelling. Mark looked down. "I know." Emily didn't suddenly become my defender. She didn't need to. She simply understood, finally, what she'd been asking me to overlook. After she left, Mark and I sat at the table again. "I'm sorry," he said. I believed he meant it. That was the worst part. If he'd still been arrogant, the decision would have been easy. Instead, he was trying, maybe genuinely. But Dad hadn't created that trust to determine whether Mark deserved forgiveness. He'd created time, and I finally knew what to do with some of it. "Dad didn't need to protect me from you with a lawyer," I said. "He just gave me enough time to see what I would have talked myself out of seeing." Mark looked at me. "What are you saying?" "I need you to move out." His face went still. "For how long?" "I don't know." "Are you divorcing me?" I shook my head. "I haven't decided." He looked wounded, and I hated that I still cared. But I did. And that's the first big decision in this house, that nobody else gets to make for me. This time Mark didn't argue. He moved out the following Saturday. There was no dramatic scene, no suitcase thrown onto the lawn, no neighbors pretending not to watch through their blinds. He rented a one-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes away and made 3 trips in his SUV. On the last one, he stood in the kitchen, keys in hand. "I'll leave the garage remote. You can keep it for now." He nodded. Then neither of us seemed to know what came next. 22 years of marriage, and suddenly goodbye felt too formal. "Call me if anything comes up with the house," he said. "I will." He left. I locked the door behind him, then immediately felt guilty for locking it. That's the strange thing about setting a boundary after years of avoiding one. Even when you know exactly why you're doing it, part of you still feels rude. The next few months weren't nearly as satisfying as people imagine these things to be. I missed him. Not every minute. Some evenings I enjoyed eating exactly what I wanted and watching television without Mark asking questions halfway through a show he swore he wasn't watching. But I missed the sound of his key in the door. I missed his terrible habit of leaving cabinet doors open. I even missed the way he sneezed, like someone had fired a starter pistol in the kitchen. Missing someone doesn't automatically mean you should go back. That took me a while to understand. Mark found another sales job after about 7 weeks. It paid less than his old one and required more driving. When he told me, I said, "I'm glad." He gave a crooked smile. Not exactly the retirement package I had in mind. A few months earlier, that would have started a fight. This time he added, "Nobody's fault but mine." Diane stayed in her rental. She renewed for another year after negotiating a smaller increase with the landlord. Melissa took a full-time position with an established design firm and started working through her debts on a repayment plan. Nobody ended up destitute. Nobody lost a home. The catastrophe everyone had been preparing me to prevent turned out to be ordinary life. Bills, jobs, rent, the same things everyone deals with, before and after a death in the family. Mark and I began counseling, separately at first, then together. I won't pretend therapy produced some magical conversation where he said exactly the right thing and 22 years of marriage suddenly made sense. Mostly it was uncomfortable. One afternoon our counselor asked Mark why he'd been so certain I would eventually go along with his plans. He sat with that for a long time. Then he said, "Because she always came around." I looked at him. "No." He turned toward me. I usually gave in. He started to answer, then stopped. There wasn't much left to say. I'd spent years calling that compromise. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it wasn't. Eventually Mark apologized without trying to explain himself afterward, and that mattered. He said he was sorry for turning Dad's death into a financial event before I'd even had time to grieve. He apologized for making promises on my behalf. He admitted he had treated my eventual agreement as inevitable. I believed him. I also believed he was changing. But here's something I wish I'd understood when I was younger. Someone becoming better doesn't obligate you to return to the version of yourself who had to be hurt before they changed. After several months, I asked for a legal separation. Later, we began the divorce process. It wasn't vicious. It wasn't painless either. Around that time, Emily and I finally started clearing out Dad's house. I'd put it off longer than I should have. One Saturday morning, we stood in his kitchen, surrounded by cardboard boxes and things that somehow seemed too ridiculous to throw away. Dad owned 4 tape measures. 4. Emily held them up. Was Grandpa expecting a nationwide tape measure shortage? He didn't trust the one in the garage. Why not? I don't know. He never told me. We laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in Dad's house since he died. There was no final secret waiting in a drawer, no dramatic letter we'd somehow overlooked. Just Dad, hardware store receipts, 3 pairs of reading glasses, an old coffee maker I'd tried twice to replace, measurements scribbled on the back of an envelope for shelves he'd apparently planned to build and never did. Emily was wrapping coffee mugs when she asked, "Do you think Grandpa knew Dad would do all this?" I thought about it. No. She looked surprised. Really? I think he was worried. I folded another box. There's a difference. Dad hadn't known my marriage better than I did. He hadn't set a trap for Mark. He'd simply noticed something that troubled him and arranged his estate so I wouldn't have to make permanent decisions under pressure. That was all. It turned out to be enough. I didn't do anything exciting with the inheritance. Sorry to disappoint anyone hoping I bought a red convertible and moved to Tuscany. I strengthened my retirement accounts. I worked with Samuel and a financial advisor to make sure my housing was secure once the divorce finalized. Most of the money stayed invested. I set up an education fund for any grandchildren I might one day have. I made a donation to the community college scholarship program Dad had quietly supported for years. Later, I gave Emily money toward a down payment. But before I did, we sat down and talked it through. How much? Why? What expectations came with it? None, as it turned out. That conversation lasted 20 minutes. It may have been the healthiest financial exchange anyone in my family made all year. The final divorce paperwork took longer than either of us expected. When we met to sign one of the last sets of documents, we got coffee afterward. I know that probably sounds strange. 22 years doesn't vanish just because lawyers have added tabs to a folder. Mark stirred his coffee for a while, then said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd just stayed at work? Sometimes we'd probably still be married." I thought about it. Maybe. He looked at me. But the problem would still be there. What problem? You thought being my husband gave you ownership of things that belonged to me. He looked down. I added, "The money just made it expensive enough for me to finally notice." Mark nodded slowly. "I wish I'd noticed first." So did I. We finished our coffee, hugged in the parking lot, and walked to separate cars. For a long time, I thought Dad's final gift to me was $3.8 million. It wasn't. The most valuable thing he left me was time. Because without that trust, I know exactly what would have happened. Mark would have apologized. Diane would have cried. Melissa would have explained how badly she needed it. And I would have looked at the numbers and told myself there was plenty to go around. I would have given in, not because I wanted to, but because somewhere along the way, I'd started confusing keeping everyone happy with being a good wife. 3 days after my father died, my husband quit his job because he believed my inheritance meant neither of us would ever have to work again. He was wrong. Mark went back to work. And in a strange way, so did I. Except the job I finally gave up was one I'd been doing for 22 years without ever noticing. Smoothing things over, giving in, and mistaking a quiet house for respect. If you've ever had to learn the difference between peace and respect, you probably already know why it took me this long.